Hello and welcome. I'm Cameron Merrill, and I serve as the editor of Ministry Matters and Leadership Resources with the United Methodist Publishing House, and I'm also a pastor. I'm a pastor of a local church in North Carolina, the North Carolina Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. And I'm glad to be here with you all today. I'm joined today by the Reverend Dr. Lovett Weems, who is the Distinguished Professor of Church Leadership and Senior Consultant of the Lewis Center for Church Leadership at Wesley Theological Seminary in DC. Dr. Weems was the founding director of the Lewis Center after spending 18 years as president of St. Paul's School of Theology in Kansas City. Previously, he was a local church pastor in Mississippi for many years, and in addition to this new book that we're highlighting today, The Right Questions for Church Leaders, he's also the author of several important books on leadership and Methodism that have been published by Abingdon Press in the past. So welcome, Lovett. I'm glad to be here with you today to talk about this book and hear more from you about the right questions for ministry today.
Thank you, Cameron. It's a pleasure to be with you and with everyone on the webinar.
Great. Thanks to everyone who's joining us live. This workshop, this webinar will be a little different from some of our previous ones. Myself and a couple of other local church leaders will be represented here today. You're going to be joining Lovett to briefly talk with him, to offer a situation, a scenario that we're experiencing in our ministry that we're currently wrestling with, so that Dr. Weems can help us think through those challenges. He's going to help us think about the questions that we might not be asking. And we hope to begin the process of creating plans that each of us can act on in response to that. So with this different format, you're also invited to ask any questions that you may have throughout the workshop using the comments. And we'll collect those questions and answer as many of them as we can at the end of our conversation, including any situation that you're facing for which you would be interested in how questions can help you move forward in it as well. So Dr. Weems, before we dive into the different issues or worries that we're facing, I want to ask you, with all of the work and leadership that you've done for these many years, what prompted you to write a book about asking questions at this time?
For a long time, I've taught students that leaders do not have to have answers, but leaders must have the right questions. And so after the establishment of the Lewis Center for Church Leadership at Wesley Seminary in 2003, and we started a weekly online newsletter, Leading Ideas, we've included in each issue a feature called The Right Question. And so in this book, we have collected questions on 57 different topics related to church life, whether it's children or stewardship or property or hiring or all the many kinds of issues that churches face internally and as they relate to their communities and issues of the day. And even if one of the exact questions is not one that fits a situation one faces, they often will inspire your own variations of those questions. And so often we try to lead with answers when we may be better off leading with questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that background. And I know I'm sure many of our viewers today have been beneficiaries of that conversation that's been going with the Lewis Center for all these many years. And it's an important reminder. I mean, I think many of us feel the pressure of needing to have the answers when folks come to us in leadership within the life of the church, but to be reminded that learning how to ask the right questions is the first place to start is an important reminder. So I want to begin with my own context and give you a little bit of that background, and then hear from you about what questions I should ask differently in response. As I mentioned, I serve as a pastor of a small historic congregation in a growing but historic town in North Carolina, and like many of our smaller congregations, especially over the last few years, we are looking at the reality of the challenges of financial sustainability into the future. And I was actually thinking of a leading ideas conversation that I heard not long ago, where the speaker was observing that it's now taking between 2 to 7 new households to replace the financial contributions of just one household that we might have lost through death or through relocations or just disengagement in the last few years. And when my leaders and I have sat down and done that math, it's a pretty stark and kind of challenging realization of what that would mean for our congregation's capability. So in this era of more diffuse giving patterns and changing church participation, what questions should leaders like me and our congregation be asking to help develop more sustainable financial models?
Cameron, your situation is quite common.
Yeah.
And you're very right about needing multiple new people to make up for any person that you lose. And there are several reasons for that. If you are getting new people, they're likely to be younger because there aren't many older demographics than what we have in the church these days. They're likely to have fewer assets, more debt. But the main thing is they probably will lack the spiritual maturity of the people that you've lost. So some categories of questions would be, one set would be, how do you assess your vulnerability? And so you'd say, what trends are we seeing, especially over the last 3 to 5 years, not only in dollars, but number of givers, average size of gift, and those sorts of things. Then asking, what percentage of our income each year comes from people age 70 and above? There's not a right or wrong answer. You simply need to know how it's changing over the last 3 to 5 years. And that's part of your vulnerability index. Another question is, how much, if any, of our operating income comes from non-recurring or unpredictable income sources, like special funds or reserves or bequests or things like that. The goal is to have zero operating expenses paid, and because you're always vulnerable, and there are other uses you need for that unpredictable income, especially capital expenses on that. Then, in terms of the near term, you always want to make sure you're making giving as easily and as accessible. Most churches got that figured out during the pandemic. But remember that the high point for people writing checks was 1994. So for many people, the check they write on Sunday for church is the only check they write all week. So we have to take that into account. But another question is, where can we save?
Sure.
And an easy way to think about that is, would it be easier for us to find a place to save $1,000 or to find a new contributor of $1,000? So you just want to pay attention to that. Also, are there assets we have that could be used more productively for ministry? For example, one church had a piece of property that a business wanted to pay them a pretty good price for because of the location. And they eventually decided not to sell, but their debate was all about whether people preferred to sell or to keep the land.
Right. right,
That's not a debate related to your mission.
right.
The mission question should have been, since every dollar we receive and every piece of property we have is to be used for one purpose and one purpose alone, and that's to fulfill our church's mission.
Mm,
Let's take that piece of property and let's look at the last 20 years and how it's been utilized for our mission. Have we used it as a playground for children? Have we used it as for homeless people? How have we used that property? And then, if we were to get this large amount of money invested, use a conservative spending rate to benefit our ministry, so it would continue over time,
yeah,
what might that do?
right.
So it's a way of reframing.
Mm.
Now, for the long term, you indicate that it's a growing community.
Yeah, it
So
is.
there, a question would be, how do we do our ministry, and especially worship, so that we we are connecting ever more people with
Mm,
God's love through Christ?
mm,
Uh, Another question would be, who are the people God has given us? John Wesley always began with people. He didn't begin with clergy. He didn't begin with churches. He didn't even begin with doctrine,
mm,
because he said, you don't know what doctrine to draw from unless you know more about the people.
mm.
So how do we look at our community the way God would look at it,
Yeah.
which would not be our membership role? It would be a God view. Who are the people God has given
Yeah.
us? And then to just think about the your time, staff time,
Right.
laity time. How much of it is invested on those who are not part of
Hmm.
our community?
Hmm.
And then, how do we help everyone in our congregation grow spiritually? Because,
Yeah.
especially with new people, but the greatest diversity in any congregation is the diversity of spiritual maturity.
Mm, mm,
So it's as people grow in spiritual maturity that they tend to grow in their discipleship and their giving. So
mm,
remember, those very faithful people who are dying or leaving,
mhm.
uh, they did not become generous givers on
Right.
day one.
Right. Right.
So we need to think about, how are we working with
Mhm.
other people today so that someday they will grow to that kind of maturity.
Yeah. No, thank you. Those are, I really appreciate the categories of questions as well and how to think about them at different rates and stages. I mean, those are different questions for different times and seasons, but all a part of the same conversation. That's a really helpful framework for thinking about that. I also want to bring in the Reverend Dr. Katie Bishop. Katie is the lead pastor in a United Methodist congregation as well in Maryland, and Dr. Bishop is the author of Bringing Our Children to Jesus, equipping parents to be active in their child's discipleship journey. She's a contributor to Speaking Truth, Women Raising Their Voices in Prayer from Abingdon Press, and a student of Dr. Weems, a student and graduate of Wesley Seminary herself. So, Katie, I'd love to hear more about your context and your question and how these questions and asking better questions might help.
Hello, and thank you for having me here today. For the last 4 decades, MUMC has been committed to Christian formation through small groups and disciple Bible study classes and Sunday school classes with various leaders. There has been a real commitment to adult Christian formation. We have a congregation that is nearly 1,000 members. In the past, we've sent students to seminary. We've offered a variety of different levels of formation and supported education of all of our affinity groups who are committed to living Christian life together. However, about 8 years ago, we began to see a significant decline in the desire to participate in these type of adult Christian formation opportunities, which was multiplied when the pandemic hit. Some small groups were able to adapt and have gained great strength and connection, and post-pandemic are still thriving, but there is a lot of opportunities that were in the past that have dissolved, and leaders that have committed to serve in different ways or have since moved out of the area. Now that we're no longer putting out the fires of the pandemic season, our congregation has begun to reevaluate our mission and our vision, which includes agreeing on a set of core values. As our congregation begins to find revival in this post-pandemic season, how do we determine if Christian formation for adults is a core value of the past or a path that will lead to our future? And how do I, as the sole pastor of this congregation, determine my role in helping to commit to this type of goal and facilitate such programs?
Katie, thank you for that question. You are discovering, like almost all churches, that there are real differences post-pandemic in church life, and especially in recruiting volunteers to lead small groups such as the ones you've had. But also there are other changes. And first, you want to avoid the temptation of, when a church has had a long tradition of something and that seems to be falling away, to panic or say, how can we recreate this? The beginning point is not with the groups. The beginning point is always with the people. And so then you want to say, how can we best help the people of the congregation take their next fateful step on their discipleship journey? Now, in the past, those small groups and those very well done study groups have been an important part of that. So a question you might ask to test out the viability of what you've done in the past is to take the groups that are still functioning and ask, what characteristics do they have in common? Mm-hmm. And just brainstorm the words, phrases that come to mind about them. Maybe if you know about the groups that no longer seem to work, do the same thing. But then also, while you're doing this, pay attention to where some of the other living edges are in the church right now. That is, I think of a living edge as something that if you forget to announce it, it still happens. It's not something you have to plead for people to attend. And then just write all the words that characterize it. So whatever you do, you're going to try to exemplify the characteristics and new things that are part of those living edges. Also, as you look at the continuing groups, are those characteristics going to be hard to replicate? Mm-hmm. For instance, are they composed of people that have 20 or more years in the church or something, or have strong ties there that may be hard to replicate with newer people in the congregation? Also, people often, some of the living edges today are things that have a beginning time and an ending time, and they don't call for a long commitment. Before the Episcopal Bishop Eugene Sutton was bishop, he was at the National Cathedral. And I remember once when he was speaking to a group of students, he said that one of his responsibilities was men's ministry. And they had learned at the cathedral that they never can use the word group. If they talk about any men's group, men flee from it. But he said, we do men's breakfast, men's weekends, men's trips, men's debates, men's panels, all kind of thing. But we never use the word group because of that fear that they're going to get into something that would go forever. And then think about the people that are spiritually mature, people who are growing, who are not a part of the ongoing groups. And think with them, how is God working in your life? How did you come to this point? And see if you can get some ahas. So you always want to do that. And so I think of looking for clues as a spiritual discipline. You're paying attention. What are the things that you thought just a few people would attend and a lot of people attended? Mm-hmm. What are the things that used to be strong that aren't now? How do you compare those? And then sometimes those of us who are pastors will, if something needs to be improving, our immediate step might be to jump in ourselves and say, I'm going to lead 1 or 2 or 3 of these. But you need to find out what's most needed for people to take their next faithful steps. And it won't be the same for everybody. But then think about your role as what do people in this congregation have a right to expect of me, so that if I don't do it, no one else can or will, because no one has the position of pastor. And so that may not be doing all the studies, even if you enjoy doing that, because it may be taking away from something else that people have a right to expect, such as preaching or oversight or things like that. So I hope that helps.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Katie. Dr. Weems, we're going to hear next from Sam, a colleague of ours who was going to be with us today, but due to a last-minute emergency wasn't able to be here with us live. But Sam is a deacon who is serving what he says is a mid-sized parish in one of the 10 largest cities in Alabama. Sam's coordinating the Vacation Bible School after a 5-year hiatus. I think many of us have some degree of a shared experience in that change, as you mentioned, with the pandemic. And Sam's coordinating it. He's leading the efforts to develop, coordinate, and lead that after that hiatus. And as most of us know, I think many of us know, VBS is another thing that has changed in the life of the church in these recent years. And so Sam's question that he's trying to think about and have better questions alongside of is, as it seems to be the case in many churches around his size, the church no longer has a children's minister, a professional person on staff. And that corresponds to, he says, to the fact that the attendance of new families with children has been slowly declining or more unsteady in the last few years. So right now his church only has about 6 children, 2 of them his own, who attend with some regularity, and most of them are not, as he says, heavily engaged in the programmatic life of the church. It's not to say they aren't engaged, though. They come to worship with their families in children's chapel on Sundays. Their staff and volunteers speak with them and attend their family events, plays and athletic games and programs pretty regularly. And the church hosted events and programs like Christmas parties and Wednesday night children's activities. They're not as attended. And so, and Sam says that since they have released the save the date to begin advertising VBS back in early March ahead of the summer, all but 2 families are unable to attend as of now. And he says, of course, we know that VBS isn't primarily for their children and their congregation. They're thinking of it in terms of outreach. They've partnered with the local Boys and Girls Club, tried working with other churches and advertising as widely as they can, although they're continuing to try that even more extensively. Even so, with little over a month until VBS, they've only had a few children register, and they believe in the importance of it. They have volunteers committed to it, and they have folks reaching out to others in the community with invitation. They have money allocated for it. So it feels like they're doing all the right things, Sam says, but they aren't getting a lot of traction. he's wondering what questions should they be asking that they're not asking, given this disconnection between the energy and impulse and the lack of engagement that they're seeing.
Well, the first question should be around this immediate Vacation Bible School coming up before long.
Yeah.
And I think there you've got to pull together some of the key players in that and say, given this, what appears to be a very, very small group of children who will be participating, what should our goal be? And what do we most hope God will do in the lives of these children? What will be different about these children?
Right.
And if in that conversation, it appears that doing Vacation Bible School for such a small group is not viable, then the next question needs to be, how do we, in the most personal and sensitive way, connect immediately to the people who have expressed interest?
Right.
But then you're in a position, whether you have it this year or not, to ask some basic questions. And this is such a good illustration of why it is that so many things don't do very well, that we do not think of what the fruit is we expect the ministry to bear when we create it. So the question at the end of the summer is not, did our Vacation Bible School reap the harvest of spiritual benefit in the lives of the children and their families that we had intended? No, the question is, did we have Vacation Bible School this summer? So we're not saying we have Vacation Bible School so that, or we have ushers so that, or a choir so that, or even worship so that. It's that we are doing it. Well, you see, you have to ask questions about what the harvest is you seek to reap before you even know what seed to plant.
Yeah.
And so if you don't know what God is leading you to plan, why to plan the Vacation Bible School, then you're not going to know who to recruit to teach, what literature to use, or anything like that. So that's a more basic question. There are churches that have had significant Vacation Bible Schools that don't have children at all. Through a commitment to their neighborhood. But it means you've got to get into a conversation very early with some of the stakeholders in the community. And in one community, they discovered that given the work situations there, that they probably would need to provide a meal, maybe two, and it may need to be all day. So you have to look at that community context to know. And then if it's not viable, then what now is God calling us to do with the children we have?
Yeah. No, I think that's so that question is even more pertinent in various forms than it's probably ever been, or at least it has such an important place that we need to be continuing to ask. And related to that, we have a question from one of our viewers that I think reflects kind of the other side of Sam's question, and I think some of what you said will apply, but differently. This person shared that in their congregation in Iowa, that they're finding that longtime volunteers are experiencing burnout, but recruiting new leaders has also become increasingly difficult, and people seem willing to help with one-time events, but are resistant to this ongoing commitment that we used to rely so heavily on. And so this leader was wondering what questions we should be asking that can help us better understand the reluctance and help develop more sustainable approaches to developing volunteers and leaders into the future. And I wonder if part of that isn't the question of, are we doing this for the sake of we think we need to be doing something, or is there a fruit that we're imagining comes from it that may help? But I wonder what other questions you would raise with that.
Well, to whether it's Vacation Bible School or Sunday school or whatever,
Yeah.
it really does help to be able to say to somebody,
Yeah.
we're planning a Vacation Bible School so that the children of our church will come to love God more, and
Right.
we'll reach children in the community we've not reached before. So
Right.
that at least gives them a reason, instead of saying we just need somebody to
Mhm.
teach for us. But also to recognize it's important to stay positive. It's so easy to get negative.
Mm.
So you start positive. You assume the best until people prove you otherwise. It's what I call a presumption of grace. And you can start by saying, I remember my Sunday school teacher from when I was in the third grade. And, some of you have had that experience.
Yeah.
Would you like to be that person for someone else? But, some of you have said, you're not available every Sunday,
Right.
and that you have family that you have to care for in other places, or their children's activities. So that's the reason we're developing a team system, and we are this year recruiting teams, and then the teams themselves can decide how they divide the Sundays, and maybe sometimes when they're teaching together. Maybe one has a particular gift for one aspect of teaching, and
Right.
another. So at least you can test that out with people,
Right.
and see. So you assume that the people want to serve as much as they ever did, but they face special challenges.
Mhm.
And so how can we take account of that and
Mhm.
get some of the people to help with that? And so having those conversations, asking, how can we make this possible? What would you need in order to do this?
Right.
But the end result always is what we are hoping that will happen in the lives of those children. Because if people can't do what we need done, then
Mhm.
even if they're willing to teach, we don't need them teaching.
Mhm.
And how do we support when they do that? And
Right.
how do we not assume they will do it forever? That's one of the reasons people have.
Yeah.
Think about, as you plan for a new Sunday school year beginning in September, think about, this is our faculty for our Sunday school for this year.
Yeah.
And we have some who are returning,
Right.
but we have some vacancies here.
Mhm.
And is this a way that God may be leading you? And then you recruit, but then you give people a chance after that year to renew or not,
Mhm. Right.
because they're so afraid they're going to get into something that they will have to do it forever.
Yeah. No, and I appreciate the way that you're framing these conversations, these responses, in terms of not just questions hypothetically to be asked or questions for a small subset of leaders, but questions that are being posed back to the congregation as a whole. I think that oftentimes leaders don't think we're empowered to stand up and ask questions of the people. We're supposed to be presenting solutions and answers and
That's
responses.
right.
Positive.
And put it positively, say,
Yeah.
your church has a pastor, but all of us have our ministries.
Mhm.
And you have a right to expect of your church to help you to
Yeah.
discern the ministry God's calling you to.
Yeah.
Some of those may be within the congregation.
Sure.
Some of may be outside the congregation, but all of us have gifts.
Mm.
And so that's why we're going to be helping. Some of you have said, what
Yeah.
are some of the needs that you have in the coming year in the church? So we are making those available. But the main thing is not for us to get people for our needs. The most important thing is for each one of you to find your ministry. So if it's not teaching, is it serving? If it's not serving, is it something else? So some way to keep that conversation going and not make it look, you see, it's what I call outside to inside thinking. Usually we do inside to outside. We say, folks, we've got 3 Sunday school classes with no teachers.
Right.
And, you know, people listening to that could get the impression that the church wants me to do something for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That the church doesn't exist to be served. So what you want to do is to begin with their need to serve. And so you begin with their need to serve rather than your need to be served as a church.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And there's always the opportunity to ask other questions to continue, and hopefully asking the right questions just leads us into even better questions broadly that we should be asking about these things. But I'm curious, as we kind of wrap up today, as we end this conversation, but hopefully invite folks into that work. And maybe this is an unfair question to ask. Given, your role with the Lewis Center over time, you continue to help lead us in thinking about the shifts and the realities of the United Methodist Church and of the broader church in America. If you had to identify a question that you think congregational leaders, clergy, and key lay leaders should be asking of themselves today, what is that question? What's the question they should be asking themselves often today?
Well, I think one is, who are the people God has given us? So much of our planning in our churches does not begin with the people God has given. It begins with our membership, with the people who are there. Whereas any church, when it begins, is outwardly focused. And so much of our energy in any given week is more inward than it is outward. And so John Wesley's understanding of the word parish was not of a church constituency, but it was more a geographic understanding of the people that God has given us, and that all of them have a claim on the church, and we have a claim of responsibility there. So that's, for instance, in early American Methodism, Bishop Asbury became convinced that the clergy left to their own devices would stay around the cities of Philadelphia and New York, where the living was a little easy. But he developed a rural strategy, a sent ministry of going where the people are. And it fit the nation, and we spread out. But today, we've lost that sense of frontier. What are the frontiers? So another question is, and this is one that as a pastor I use so often when I go to a new church, I would say, all of you have lived here longer than I have. Some of you have lived here your entire lives. So I need your help with this question. Knowing the community as you do, when we gather for worship on Sunday, who's missing?
Wow. Yeah.
And often there was silence.
Yeah.
For people to speak. But who are the people that are in our community, but not in our congregation? Used to, that typical churchgoers were fairly reflective of the general population. Today, regular church attenders are older, less diverse, have more assets, more likely to be married, have more education than the general population.
Yeah.
We also know that active churchgoers spend most of their time with other active churchgoers, whether from their church or another church. So increasingly, our churches are out of touch with the community. So finding ways to understand the community more. There are two things I've noticed in vital congregations over the years. They connect people with God, and they connect with their communities. And so one question that's often asked and people are familiar with is what I call the mission equivalent of a financial audit. And that's once a year to ask the question, if your church closed today, who would miss it other than your members? And each year, make a list of the people that would say, what will we do? And then a year later, see if that list is getting longer or shorter. That's what God is calling us to. But with the pressure of decline, we tend to turn inside. And when it should be just the opposite, trying to turn outward.
Thank you, Dr. Weems. Thank you so much for the conversation, for these responses, the thoughtfulness behind these questions, this whole book, and this ongoing work that you've been leading with the Lewis Center and other places for so long. Learning how to ask the right questions for ministry is an incredibly important gift that many of us need to cultivate. So thank you for joining us for this webinar, for this conversation, and we're really grateful for the time that you've spent with us.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Thanks. And thank you all for joining us too. Thank you for your questions. We hope that this resource continues to be helpful to you as you lead in the church that you are a part of today. To discover more about this book and what Dr. Weems is leading us into, you can go to amplifymedia.com/therightstuff, where you can find more information about Dr. Weems and the new book. Thank you to Amplify Media for sponsoring this webinar, this workshop conversation. You can always visit their site to learn more about the resources that they're providing to churches just like yours. Thanks again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future.